Okay, well, welcome to the dining table. And this is not Steve McAlpine who's with me. I don't know where Steve is. He's probably going to join us at some point. He's late for his food, so he's not getting anything. This is Rob Smith, and Rob has popped in, which is really, really wonderful because Rob is also an expert on what we're going to look at today, aren't you, Rob?
Well, a dabbler.
A dabbler. Now, what we're going to look at is I'm going to show you this book, That Hideous Strength by Melvin Tinker. And there's a guy called David Robertson on the back who really, really commends it. And I really do commend it because there's another book here called Cynical Critical Theories, and I would commend that as well. But one, it's not as Christian, and two, it's a lot harder. This will really, really help you understand a key area of our society. So first of all, can I welcome Melvin all the way from, tell us where you are in England.
Well, I'm from the city of Hull in Yorkshire, which is the sort of northeast end of England, and it's a bit of a rainy day here.
Okay. And you are a retired Church of England pastor, is that right?
Yes, I retired from the Church of England. I was vicar of St. John Newland for 26 years and just retired from there. And well, so when we say retired, you just change post, you're doing something else. But
yeah.
I retired from the Church of England, that's
correct. Okay. Now, let's get straight into this book, That Hideous Strength. First of all, some people will recognize the title because it is, well, for me, it's I keep, C.S. Lewis books for me are like Bible verses. I say my favorite Bible verse is, but that changes from week to week. But I think That Hideous Strength and that whole sci-fi trilogy are probably my favorite C.S. Lewis books. And I'm assuming that's where it comes from, isn't it?
That's correct, yeah. The origin of the whole book and linking with the title was in 2018. I was asked to give a talk on cultural Marxism at the GAFCON conference, Global Anglican Future Conference in Jerusalem. And as I was sort of thinking about this, as these things happen, sort of in the middle of the night, Lewis's book came to mind. Because as I was looking into cultural Marxism, the way in which the idea of a particular cultural elite can actually shape and change and mold the whole populace through fairly devious means, to be honest, I thought, well, this rings a bell. And then it came to me, yes, of course, it's there in That Hideous Strength. Lewis saw this in the 1940s. But he saw it in the influence being quite different. He saw it in terms of an elite group of scientists through basically the philosophy of scientism. Everything can be explained through the lens of science. And that led to a dehumanizing effect. Well, people may think, like, looking what's going on in our country with COVID and the influence of scientists today, hey, that's coming true. But the same model, I think, applies to what's happening with cultural Marxism. So I brought the two together. Kevin Van Hooser said, I've never known anyone who's linked together a C.S. Lewis book and a spaghetti western.
That's true.
How the West was lost.
and the Tower of Babel, really.
And the Tower of Babel, of course,
yeah.
Which, of course, is behind Lewis's book.
Yes.
That's where, again, he got the title from someone else, actually. And the idea was this idea, the Tower of Babel, humanity coming together as one to try to reshape reality, to get rid of the boundaries that God had set.
Yeah. Now, can I ask you both about the cultural Marxism thing? First of all, I mean, but let me say something about the Tower of Babel. I think watching what's going on in the world in the past couple of years, it does feel like a Tower of Babel moment, doesn't it? It feels as though globalization and all the other things that we were placing our hope in have just disappeared. But cultural Marxism, I had a friend who, when I mentioned cultural Marxism, said, oh, no, not you too. You've just turned right wing. So what I want both of you to do is to answer that objection. And well, I'm going to start with Rob, actually, and say how he would respond to that objection. And then I'm going to ask you, Melvin, to explain what cultural Marxism is in words of less than 50 syllables, because it gets quite technical and difficult if you go the technical side of it. But there's a simple way of explaining it, I think, and I think you can do it. But how do you answer the objection, Rob? First of all, if you use the phrase cultural Marxism, you've written about it, and people say, "Oh, you're just right wing."
Yeah, well, what I found I needed to do for my own understanding was to go back into the roots of what is called cultural Marxism. It's called that in the literature, in the academic literature. It's not something right wingers or fundamentalist Christians have thought up. It goes right back into those who were seeking to pioneer a developed form of Marxism. So it has other names: neo-Marxism and existential Marxism and various other sort of variants. But cultural Marxism, to my mind, is about as clear and accurate a descriptor as to what the movement is. Now, if you ask, well, exactly what is it? It's basically a developed form of Marxism which takes sort of Marxist categories with a Marxist goal, but changes how you get from A to B.
So does it culturally rather than economically?
Yes. So you don't. Yes. Yeah. Traditional or original Marxism was an economic theory, and cultural Marxism is saying no. You've actually got to change culture if you want to change anything else, rather than seeing that culture is a fruit of economics. No, economics is a fruit of culture. So it's really flipping around the original, traditional Marxist thought.
Melvin, is that a fair enough summary?
Brilliant summary. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think in terms of this sort of underlying philosophy, if you like, to try and sort of encapsulate what lies at the heart of the heartbeat of cultural Marxism, it's really to do with the notion of liberation. The idea that human beings, it's almost like, use those things, that man is free, but everywhere is in chains type of thing. That human beings find themselves in states of oppression through various structures, particularly oppressive forms of government and institutions, oppressive institutions such as what we consider the church and the family. And so what cultural Marxism envisages is total liberation, that we're free from such oppressive, repressive institutions and traditions, so that man can be whatever he wants to be, to actually realize his deep-rooted desires. And that really lies at the heart of it. And then cultural Marxism, as it takes it on, it considers a particular way in which this can be achieved. That Karl Marx, it was an economic lens through which everything was seen, but with cultural Marxism, as the name suggests, it's culture. So the idea is that you capture culture, you change culture, you then change people's thinking, you change people's behavior, you bring about what some call radical democracy, which is anything but.
Yeah.
Does that help? Is that clear?
It is clear. I'm getting quite a feedback on sound here. We'll carry on from where we were.
Okay.
Right. For both of you, if it's about liberation, well, in fact, for Melvin, actually, surely that's what the gospel is about. So are you one of these Marxist Christians, a liberation theology Christian? What's the difference? I mean, know the truth will make you free. Isn't the whole gospel about liberation?
It is about liberation, but not in these terms. So the Marxist idea of liberation is basically it's the liberation suggested by the serpent in the garden. Yeah. It's to be free from any constraint. It's to be ultimately free from God. Not only free from God, it's free to be God. And that is what we're talking about. It's a de-godding of God. It's making man God. It's and so at the end of the day, far from it being liberating, it ends up being tyrannical and restricting, and leads to untold misery, as one can see with traditional Marxism around the world, and history testifies to that.
Yeah.
If you really want to see what freedom is like, then you consider the gulags or what happened in Mao's China. Yeah. Whereas the gospel liberation is to be free to be as God made us. to have a relationship, a proper relationship with him, being rightly related to each other, being rightly related to his creation. That's true freedom. Freedom to do what you ought rather than free to do what you want.
Okay, well, let me push this just a little bit further, because I'm a historian, and I know about Mao. I know about Stalin. Obviously, I know about Hitler and other things. But I know the Marxist regimes have been the bloodiest in the world's history. And the disconnect that some people will have, they'll say, you mean all the cultural Marxist stuff that we look at, the progressivism, and I mean, I'm talking here about these cynical critical theories, that particular book with Pluckrose and Lindsay. Are we really saying that our modern liberal Western societies could disintegrate into that? Because when I say that to people, they think you're just a conspiracy theorist. So how do you handle with let's leave out the fact that you're right wing, which is how, if people want to dismiss someone, just say, oh, you're a Nazi, you disagree with me, you're a Nazi. So, Melvin, I'm sure you've heard that. But what about you're just a conspiracy theorist? This is just a mess up rather than a deliberate conspiracy. How would you respond to that? And then maybe Rob as well.
Yeah, well, it depends what you mean. I mean, Rob makes a good point. Sorry, you'll probably tell this anyway. But the idea of the conspiracy is that generally it's secret. There's nothing secret about cultural Marxism, and I think that's a very, very good point to make. So we're not. I don't think there's anyone who thinks you've got some sort of spectre-like organization that meet together in dark, smoky rooms to plan the downfall of the West. However, that's not to say that there is, if you like, as I put it, a sort of conspiracy of circumstances where things conspire together to produce, so we'll say, if you like, the sort of perfect storm. And I think that is exactly what's happening, and what has been happening certainly since the end of the Second World War in the West, with the rise, the influence of the academics from the Frankfurt School that went over to America, and then as a result of that, you've got the basically way in which these ideas have been disseminated now into mainstream culture, largely through education. The academy is pretty well being captured by this, especially the humanities, but also the media. Very, very strong, very, very strong. Certainly in this country with BBC, I would say, but also you look at Silicon Valley, and the power and influence of Google and so on, all the social networks. Clearly left wing, clearly cultural Marxist.
So, Rob, with that, taking that on board, is it Gramsci's march through the institutions? Is that what's happened?
Well, absolutely, yeah. The long march through the institutions, which was Gramsci's strategy, even though that wasn't he didn't coin the language, but that was the strategy, and it's really been followed to the letter and very successfully. And again, the documentary sort of evidence and proof of this is everywhere, and there's a lot of celebration of it. It was what they set out to do, and I suppose in that sense you could say, yes, there's a kind of conspiratorial element to it, but as Melvin's pointed out, it wasn't secret. And so we're now at a point of conquest. And so news media, entertainment media, all the sort of, I guess, institutions of our society have really been successfully indoctrinated into a range of ideas that have a certain diagnosis of the human problem built into them, and then an understanding of what the solution is. And effectively, the solution is to, really to tear down Western civilization as we've known it, and to cut the sort of Judeo-Christian roots of that civilization, so that something else can take its place. But again, as we've seen every time in history, anything remotely like this has been tried, it's ended up in disaster. So, I think we're just another phase of really what started right back the French Revolution. I mean, Marx saw himself as really continuing the French Revolution, and the cultural Marxists are changing the strategy, but trying to reach the same end. But there's a misdiagnosis of the human condition and therefore a false solution that's being proposed as the remedy. That's the issue.
I think it is. And I think what's happening here as well is that people will say, well, which religion's the problem? We get God out of the way and humanity will be able to develop. But as Chesterton pointed out, once you lose belief in God, you also lose belief in humanity. And I think we're seeing that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to ask both of you because, believe it or not, time is going very quickly. And I'm thinking of people who watch this. And first of all, I want to ask you about non-Christians. So a non-Christian watching this, why should they care? I mean, this is just theory. Just why don't we just get on with life? This seems a bit, academic, up in the air, cultural Marxism. It doesn't really affect my life. So for both of you, why would a non-Christian care? And then I'm going to ask you why a Christian should care later, once we've done that. So Melvin, you can go first.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it is not just academic. It's not just airy fairy. It is something which is now mainstream, which expresses itself in lots of ways. Now, people may not even heard of the term cultural Marxism, but they're certainly aware of some of its effects. And so when one talks about, for instance, when people are berated for using the wrong language, as Benedict Cumberbatch was, that I think he spoke to black people rather than people of colour, and was, really castigated for doing that. It was a simple slip-up, and there was nothing mean about it. He was considered to be using racist language.
Yeah.
So there you go. You find it, I think, in what's been happening recently with Black Lives Matter, which itself is a cultural Marxist organisation, and the distinction there between the principle of racism, which is a dreadful thing, and then this political cultural Marxist organisation, which is basically a parasite on that, and then leading to all the sort of disruptions that we're seeing today in education as well. Pretty well in this country now. Whatever subject you're looking at, again, it's seen through cultural Marxist eyes. The whole business of changing our history, what's happening in America, trying to redefine the origin of the American of America itself, the 1619 project, saying, well, that it doesn't go back to 1776 with the Declaration of Independence and so on, but really it goes back to slavery. So it's inherently racist. The West is inherently patriarchal, racist, and so on. And therefore, if you find yourself in a particular category, if you're a white male, then you're going to become down upon simply by virtue of being white male. So you're getting more and more divisions, as we're seeing in America especially, but certainly in our country, in the United Kingdom. So what we're seeing as a result of this is not just academic. We're seeing major disruption and a major, I think, disruption of people's lives, and especially our children.
And it's therefore not just deconstructing society, but it's deconstructing our lives, and it's not replacing it with anything. Rob, do you want to?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I like about the Platt-Lindsay book, is just the subtitle. How activist scholarship made everything about race, gender, identity, and why this harms everybody. Because it really is fractionating society and driving the extremes too. So one of the fears, I guess, wherever you are, perhaps on the sort of political spectrum, I think it's right that we fear the extremities because they tend to do so much damage. But what we're seeing at the moment is I guess the more left the left goes, the more it provokes an extreme right responses, and so we've got all that to worry about. Just as a society. So this does affect everyone. And to go back to the language thing, one of the points that's made very well by Pluckrose and Lindsay is that if you see that reality is effectively being constructed by language, then you've got to police the language.
You change the language, of course.
And people who violate and transgress and use the wrong word, then they're creating false reality. And so you've got to come down on them, crack down on them. And it just does create this very fearful situation, which is very Orwellian, as often is said, but rightly so, because you've got a whole range of newspeak terms that you've got to continually master because they're updating all the time. And you do end up in a kind of Maoist situation where if you somehow again step over the the boundary without realizing it, you're suddenly thrust into this kind of struggle session where you've got to, confess your crime and fall on your sword.
So it affects work, it affects education, it affects family, it affects community, it affects church, it affects
marriages too.
Marriages, everything. It affects everything, and that's why it's important.
Yeah.
But Melvin, let me put this to you, and this is going to be my last question to you, and Rob as well can chip in with it because our time has gone. You're a Christian pastor. Why should you bother with this? Why shouldn't you just be preaching the gospel? Jesus didn't come and preach about Marxism, did he?
No, but he did stand out against all idolatries and falsehoods, and this is idolatry and it's a falsehood. God is the God of truth, and it's the truth will set you free. You may not teach it, you follow Him, and therefore, if we care about people, if we care about God's glory, if we care about God's humanity that He's made, then we've got to be. We've got to understand this. We don't preach the gospel into a vacuum. It's into a particular context, into a particular culture. Our Christian brothers and sisters that have been doing this for many years, under behind the Iron Curtain. They didn't simply just, as it was, preach the gospel. They preached the gospel within that context, and they paid the price. Now, if we care about people, we don't want to see their lives destroyed. We want to see people truly flourish as human beings, as God made them. And we've got to we've got to expose this. We've got to stand out against it, and we've got to put forward the alternative, which is the Christian message. And churches of all places are to be communities which actually demonstrate this, that God's ways are the best ways, and this is true human flourishing, where you do have all the different groups together. We're not into identity, except identity in Christ. And we can flourish together because we are one in Christ.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely crucial. Otherwise, well, in a few years' time, I think anyway, more and more churches are going to be simply closed down. Pastors will be, sermons will be, looked at very, very carefully. You will be allowed to say certain things and not allowed to say other things, and that includes the gospel.
Yeah, and that's, it's interesting because I've just written a piece for Christian Today on a particular case, but I've noted what Steve Chalk, the Baptist pastor, has recently put out a press release saying that if you do not accept what I would call the woke agenda on sexuality, you're breaking the law. And, you should be dealt with. And that's within the church, somebody saying that. So I can see that happening.
Yeah. And this is the point. You see, the grand scheme strategy is to bring about change through non-coercive means, culture and so on. But once you get to a particular tipping point, then you bring in coercive means to further and complete the revolution. And they will take no hostages.
Yeah.
Rob, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, a couple of things, but really just building on what Melvin said, I think. What this movement is offering, it's promising liberation, but in fact delivering bondage.
Yeah.
And so this is why it actually needs to be, unmasked. And again, it's not just enough to preach the positive. You've got to kind of spell out the negative. People won't always see the truth clearly until the error is identified. And we've got to say, no, this is the wrong way and here's why. And here's the goodness of God's way and here's why.
Yeah.
So we've just got to do both jobs. We can't content ourselves, say we just need to preach the gospel and not comment on all these false alternatives because, people won't be clear and they, may think somehow they can combine these things and they can't.
Yeah, and I think that's the extraordinary thing. And I think we are going to leave it there, Melvin. I'm going to thank you. I do. I mean, I'm going to hold this up again and just recommend this book because I absolutely do love it. And what I love about it is it's not, and neither of you gentlemen are doing this. You're not doing the woe is me, the end of the world is nigh, everything's doomed, that kind of thing. But what we're saying is the world's a mess. And this is why it's a mess. And this is what the solution is. And the solution isn't in politics. And the solution isn't, we're not advocating a right or a left wing. And the solution isn't in following a particular religious philosophy. We're saying that God has made us in his image and that what cultural Marxism does almost more effectively than anything I know of, it deconstructs that image. So it's following the line that the Russian anarchists tried to do in the 19th century, the French revolutionaries did. I think the Marxists and the Nazis tried to do as well. They all failed, and I think this progressive ideology will also fail, but it's really important for people to know this. So thank you, Melvin, for being with us. Thank you, Rob, for popping in.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Steve, wherever you are. We'll catch up with you in a wee while. And thank you for watching this. If you've watched this edition of The Dining Table, these are really important issues, so I encourage you to think about them, and God bless you.